This video focuses on strategies that research has shown can elevate our teaching practices. Being an expert in a subject, like being an excellent basketball player, doesn't automatically make you a great coach or a teacher. So let's explore how we can become more effective educators and help students connect with their learning in a more meaningful way. I would like to begin with a story of a boy named Rohan. And I'm sure we all have such Rohans in our classroom. So in a bustling classroom, Rohan sat quietly at the back, staring blankly at the board while his teacher explained the steps of a maths problem. As his classmates scribbled away, Rohan felt his chest tighten. It wasn't that he didn't want to understand, he truly did. But every time the teacher moved on to the next topic, he still hadn't grasped the last one. The layers of information piled up in his mind. Like an avalanche, he could not escape. Rohan often found himself drowning in details, unable to recall the instructions from earlier in the lesson. He tried to keep up, but it was impossible. The teacher, oblivious to the internal struggle, would sometimes call on him, only for Rohan to freeze, unable to answer. "You need to focus more, Rohan. Why aren't you paying attention?" the teacher would say. Unaware of the mental overload Rohan was facing, his classmates would sometimes giggle at him, and Rohan's embarrassments grew each day. What the teacher didn't realize was that Rohan wasn't being lazy or inattentive. His working memory was overwhelmed. Each new piece of information became tangled with the rest, and instead of processing it in manageable chunks, it all blended together in his mind, leaving him lost. This overload, left unchecked, made him dread school. It wasn't the subjects that frightened Rohan, but the fear of being called out for not keeping up, for not remembering everything in a flash. This is what made him fear school. Teachers often are unaware of how the demands of the memory can weigh down on students. Rohan wasn't unwilling to learn. He simply needed more time to process and revisit the concepts in a way that made sense to him. But without understanding this, the teacher's impatience only worsened Rohan's fears, leading to a very stigma that made him withdraw further. This fear, born from cognitive overload, could be avoided if teachers paused to break down information, gave students time to review, and recognized the signs of memory struggle, offering support rather than criticism. So you see, it wasn't that Rohan did not want to study. Every child wants to learn. Every child wants to go to school. Every child wants to excel. But unfortunately, it was because of something that we call cognitive overload, which many of us as educators are unaware of, caused Rohan to withdraw from his academics. So let us find out what exactly is this cognitive overload. I hope through this video I'll be able to share some insights that could help you as a teacher, as an educator, to help these students who are struggling with their academics. So what is this cognitive load theory? The cognitive load theory was developed by Dr. John Sweller, an Australian educational psychologist in the 80s. It refers to the amount of information our working memory can process at any given time. Understanding the cognitive load theory will help us avoid overloading the students' memory, allowing them to effectively store and recall information. Now, before we dive into cognitive load, let's take a quick look at how the memory functions, as this will set the foundation of understanding cognitive load theory. As you can see in this model of information processing journey, our sensory memory filters information, passing relevant details to the working memory, where only limited amount can be processed at once. Over time, this information is stored in the long-term memory in structures called schemas, which acts as a mental filing system. We will learn more about the schemas in our next slide. To understand what is the memory or the sensory memory, imagine a snapshot of the environment you are. The sight, smell, sound, briefly captured by your sensory organs. Sensory memory is like a temporary holding area that lasts only for a fraction of a second. Here, the brain decides whether the information is worth processing further or discarding. Most stimuli are filtered out, but some are transferred into the next stage, the working memory. Now, once information is attended to in the sensory memory, it moves into the working memory, the brain's mental working space. This is where conscious thinking happens. However, the working memory has very limited capacity, often referred to as 7 plus or minus 2 rule, meaning it can hold about 5 to 9 items at a time. To retain information, strategies like repetition or chunking are used. Without these, the information can decay and be lost. But when processed effectively, it can move to the long-term memory. Finally, when information is encoded through meaningful processing and association with prior knowledge, it transfers to the long-term memory, where it can be stored indefinitely. This storage is vast and relatively permanent, and retrieving this information depends on the strength of the associations we've built over in our working memory. Long-term memory helps us recall facts, experiences, skills, and concepts as we need in the future. So by understanding this process, educators can better design experiences to help students move information efficiently from the sensory memory into the long-term memory. That's where we want our students to be, or where we want our students to have information. Now that we've spoken about how the information flows from the sensory memory into the working memory, and then in the working memory with the help of process of repetition and chunking, we can see that that information is permanently stored in the long-term memory, and that is what you want to happen with your students. So knowing that, let us now understand what we mean by a schema. A schema is like a filing system in your brain. When we learn something new, the brain tries to fit that information into an existing file or schema. If you don't have a file for what you're learning yet, the brain creates a new file. That's the beauty of the brain. Over time, we learn more about a topic. That file will get bigger, or that schema will grow bigger and get more details put into it. When you hear the word bird, for example, your brain instantly pulls up a schema that includes common characteristics of a bird. For most of us, the bird schema is likely to include features like feather, wings, beak, ability to fly, lays eggs. So when you see a creature of these traits, you instinctively identify it as a bird. This schema helps you to process that information quickly without having to think too hard about what you are seeing. But what happens when we encounter something that doesn't quite fit our schema? Like a penguin. Penguins have feathers and wings. They have a beak. They lay eggs, but they do not fly, which challenges the initial schema you formed. Over time, you adapt and expand your schema to accommodate expectations, like learning that not all birds can fly. This process is crucial in learning. Students enter the classroom with existing schemas based on their experiences. As teachers, we help them either confirm or refine these schemas by introducing new information, and their brain adapts to this information through assimilation or accommodation. When teaching new concepts, connecting them to familiar schemas like a bird makes learning more effective and meaningful. Schemas help us make a sense of the world quickly, but also need to be flexible to accommodate new information. Using examples like a bird allows us to see how mental frameworks are built, expanded, and refined over time. Now that we understand what is a schema, let's dive into two more processes that help us adjust and grow our mental framework: assimilation and accommodation. Let's break this process down by using this illustration, which visually explains how we process new information using assimilation and accommodation in relation to schemas. We begin with a schema. So what is a schema? A schema is your current knowledge. When we encounter a new situation or object, like birds and animals in the image, our brain tries to make sense of it. On the left side, we see we've got a bird. Specifically, it is a hornbill. If you already have the current knowledge or the schema of birds, and which include the features like feathers, wings, beak, ability to fly, our brain will assimilate this new bird into the existing bird schema. This means the equilibrium is maintained. You've encountered something that fits your expectation. The feedback confirms that the object is a bird and no major changes to your schema is needed. You simply consolidate this information. Now on the right side, we see an okapi, which is not a bird but a relative of a giraffe. If you thought it was a type of a horse due to its appearance, you experience disequilibrium. This is when something doesn't fit your existing schema. You would need to accommodate this new information, updating or changing your mental framework to include that all okapis is related to giraffe and not horses. This process restores equilibrium once your schema is modified. Hereby, we understand that the process of moving between equilibrium and disequilibrium through assimilation and accommodation helps us continuously refine and update our understanding of the world. It's an essential part of learning, ensuring that our schema evolves as we encounter new information. So now, what is cognitive load? Cognitive load refers to the amount of information our working memory can process at a given time. Here, we have a visual representation of cognitive load, which is divided into three key components: intrinsic, extraneous, and germane. At the bottom of the diagram, we have intrinsic load, which represents the effort required to perform a task itself. It's a foundational load, meaning it stems from the complexity of what students are trying to learn. For example, if a student is learning algebra for the first time, the mathematical concepts are inherently challenging and adds to the intrinsic load. Next, we move up to extraneous load, represented in the middle. This load comes from how the information is presented to the students. If the instructions are unclear or the learning environment is chaotic, it increases the mental strain, adding to unnecessary obstacles in their understanding. Poorly structured materials can overwhelm the students' learning or their cognitive capacity. At the top of the diagram is germane load, which is the load devoted to processing and understanding the material. This is the desirable cognitive effort that helps students integrate new knowledge with what they already know. When we reduce extraneous load, students can devote more mental energy to germane load, allowing them to engage more deeply with the learning material. As educators, our goal should be to minimize extraneous load and ensure that intrinsic load is manageable, so students can focus more of their cognitive resources on productive learning, represented here in this germane load. Now, with regards to the intrinsic load, we can only match the topic to the experience of the learner, but we cannot do much to reduce the complexity of the topic. So I hope we all recognize what type of a fish this is. This is known as a clownfish, and it is swimming in between its environment, that is the anemone. So remembering that the clownfish lives in anemones is an example of low intrinsic cognitive load, because there's not much you have to remember there. All you got to know is, where does the clownfish live? The clownfish swims and lives in the anemone. But why the clownfish and the anemones have a relationship with each other? Remembering that the anemone protect the clownfish from predators and provides food scraps. In return, the clownfish uses its bright colors to lure fish into the anemone, where they are killed by the anemone's poison and eaten. This is more information and it is more challenging for your brain to process. So this is an example of high intrinsic cognitive load. Take a look at this picture. Here we see a child deep in concentration who looks like she is struggling with the textbook. This is a perfect example of intrinsic cognitive load. In this picture, the student is trying to read from her book. However, her expression suggests to us that she is having high cognitive load. And this type of load is called intrinsic. She is trying to decode the information from the book. She is trying to sound or pronounce the words that she is reading. She is trying to define the words, trying to make meaning of the event that she's reading about. There's too much going on all at once. In this case, the student is probably working through a challenging material that is pushing her mental limit. This is a natural part of the learning process, but it shows why teachers need to scaffold information appropriately. So next time you are working through tough content, remember, you are not alone. The load is part of the learning journey. Extraneous cognitive load is where we as teachers have the most control. Extraneous cognitive load is concerned with the material and environment we subject the students to. Poorly constructed material and busy classroom environments can lead to split attention effect and add to extraneous cognitive load. It is our job to reduce this with the way we present our lessons. The split attention effect is detrimental to the cognitive load. The split attention effect occurs when learners are required to divide their attention between multiple sources of information that need to be integrated in order for them to understand the material. For example, if a science textbook shows a diagram on one page and the explanation of the diagram on the opposite page, the learner's attention is split between reading the explanation and interpreting the diagram. The learner has to mentally integrate the two, which increases cognitive load, making it harder to understand the content. Also, irrelevant, flashy presentations and unnecessary content and images, distracting sounds and animations, and even fonts that are difficult to read, a monotone voice, and complicated vocabulary all add to extraneous load. Remember, noisy classroom, movement in the classroom, physical contact from others, pestering, arguing, visiting wrong sites, games, YouTube, all this adds to extraneous load. So if it is not controlled and it is not checked correctly, then we have a big problem. Now, when we talk about cognitive overload, it's all about how much mental effort your brain is using to process the information. Germane cognitive load refers specifically to the mental effort we put into creating schemas. Remember schemas? Those mental frameworks that help us to understand and organize new information. Think of the germane cognitive load as good load. It's the effort you invest in understanding a concept deeply, making connections, and storing that information in long-term memory. For example, when you were learning how to solve a maths problem, the germane load is the work your brain does to link that new problem-solving method to what you already know in maths. Unlike the intrinsic cognitive load, which is the natural complexity of the material itself, and extraneous cognitive load, which comes from the poorly designed instruction, the germane cognitive load helps you build understanding and strengthens learning. So while some cognitive load can slow you down, the germane load is where the magic of learning happens. It's about engaging your brain in the right way, allowing you to create strong, lasting mental connections. The key is to make sure that the other types of load, like extraneous load, are minimized so your brain can focus its energy on learning effectively. So in this session, we covered some key ideas that will help lay the groundwork for better teaching and learning. We talked about how information flows through our brain memory system, what are schemas, and how we can manage different types of cognitive load: intrinsic, extraneous, and germane. Understanding these concepts is the first step of creating more effective learning experiences, and they set the stage for what's coming next. In our next episode, we'll dive into Barak Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction, where I will look at practical strategies to support students' learning and reduce cognitive overload. So if you're interested in how to make learning more efficient and effective, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on episode 2. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.